Good morning. Well, I'm really excited about today and what we're going to do. I have one goal, one purpose, and that is that you would get some encouragement from this. That as we have a conversation together with my two brothers and two sisters, we're all actually lined up in age, so you now know who's the youngest and who's the oldest. But in this little time together, I'm hoping that it's going to help you in the relationships in your life. That as you grab some little thoughts, some things that we bring out of our story, it's going to help your story. So just great to have you this morning. It's not a fancy production. In fact, it's just 5 siblings having a conversation about what mum and dad did well, that worked in our lives, that's enabled us to each have a long, successful marriages, that we actually still like each other. We're even sitting around together, and if there were, I don't know, 2 men in the whole world I could hang out with, it'd be you two guys. You're my best friends. To sit with you, Lindell, and tell stories and hear your heart's response to life, and like it's, and as each one of us have married someone else, the family's just got bigger. Like there's nobody I don't like in our family, which is quite remarkable. So that's what we want to do, is we want to have a look into our family and our story, and it be a help to you. To give a little bit of a background, I think some people would actually describe us as growing up in a generational blessing, to have the mum and dad that we've had. But the truth is that Dad, when he first got married, in his own words, he didn't know how to be a dad. He didn't know how to be a husband. And in Dad's life growing up, his mum laid this amazing foundation in their lives. But his dad, who was a really good man, only knew one way of living, and that's being an outback stockman. And that's a pretty harsh environment for children to grow up in. And so Dad's mum raised the family in Brisbane, while his dad would be in far west Queensland, and he may come home sometimes, it might be 2 years before Dad would see his own father, or they might go out on holidays together for a little while. But in a sense, he grew up with an absentee father. And so he didn't have that model for him. And yet somehow Mum and Dad found a way to raise 5 kids and sow something into our lives that's gone on to other generations. So this is a conversation, and I'm just opening up to any one of you to have any insights that you can see that what Mum and Dad did, where that took us and how that's helped us. So over to you guys. Look at these nervous little Nellies. Once you get started, they're not going to stop.
Who's first?
Come on, Ken, you can say something.
I think one of the things that I grew up really taking on board was, as parents, their goal wasn't to control us. It was very much leading us to an understanding of God's control and leadership in our life.
Yep.
And I think so many times when I'd want to say, maybe argue with Mum about something, she would say, well, Ken, you pray about it.
That's a terrible thing for a parent to say.
And I hated it because I knew I couldn't win when I went to God. But it was that sense that both in how Mum and Dad lived their life and how they parented was establishing a sense of the lordship of Christ, and a sense that was more important than money, that was more important than your own wants. And
yes.
And so by settling that issue, even in the way they parented us, I think it made a huge difference to then how we approach everything in life. That it's not pushing an agenda, it's not pushing anything of ourselves. It's saying, well, God, what do you want here? What's your way forward?
And they very much modelled it for us. It wasn't
Yes.
just saying it. We saw that that's the way they operated and encouraged that in our lives.
Yeah, I would explain it that Mum and Dad publicly and behind closed doors were exactly the same people. And I think it's the authenticity of how they lived their life that has left each one of us in our own separate... Because, I don't know, you might have noticed, Rosie, some of us are a bit different to each other.
We are, yes.
Right? And yet we've all found this path that God has for us. Jeff's the black sheep of the family. He is the only one that's not in full-time ministry, but it's what they model, isn't it? Yep.
And I love too how they didn't just like they didn't put expectations on us to have a fancy career, or they never talked about how important it was to have high education or money or anything like that. They always talked about how important it was that Jesus was first place in your life, and that was like the only priority. Everything else was second rate. They didn't care if I was a garbage collector or a college professor or a doctor or whatever. They cared about, well, what was our relationship with Jesus like, and that's what they exampled as well.
Yeah.
And they supported and encouraged everything we had a go at or was interested in.
Yeah, Dad, I think one of his great strengths was an encourager, wasn't it? You just knew that Dad believed in us. Like Lindell, I think you described to me yesterday when we were having a little chat about this, that Dad enabled you to feel safe. What was
Yeah,
that?
I think one of, the strongest feelings I have of growing up is just safety. Like, I always felt safe with Dad, and he was so stable and, always felt loved, always felt protected. And, if I was sick or struggling or there was a problem, he would pray, and Mum would pray too. But there was a real strength in Dad that just made me feel so secure and safe. Yeah.
And yet, say, Jeff, probably Mum had a bigger impact on your life than Dad.
Yeah, well, I mean, yesterday Lindell mentioned that Mum also had a big influence on her in other areas as well. But, sorry, for me, I just felt with my mum that I could talk to her about anything. And that was, yes, she was, I guess, parenting me more because Dad was out doing things. But even still, there was that closeness of being able to talk to Mum about anything. So I shared some things with Mum that I never actually shared with Dad. And it wasn't that I didn't love Dad any less, it was just the nature of the relationship. Yeah.
So what are some of the things you think that they did well? I think that Mum and Dad, I never heard them ever argue, raise their voices at each other, and yet Dad was a very strong opinionated. I think, Jeff, what was that thing you heard one Dad say once?
This is out of context, but he did say, I'm right. In fact, even when I'm wrong, I'm right. That is taken out of context, but it was a good example of how strongly he felt about something.
And yet he didn't sort of push that on you in a sense. It was sort of, yes, he had strong opinions and he would explain everything and give you instructions about everything, but I never felt pressured to have to, do things Dad's way. He would give us that strong opinion and advice, but it wasn't a controlling, dominating.
But even with that strong opinion, there was never, for me, I know Mum and Dad would have disagreed about things, but they never did that in front of us. And so you grew up with this sense of security that Mum and Dad are together forever. There's a commitment, and I in my last conversation with Dad that I ever had on this earth, I thanked him for showing me how to love my wife.
Yeah.
I think Dad really modelled that really well. Like the gifts that Dad would give Mum, like for a birthday, he would give her a toaster, something really practical she could use.
Well, I remember he bought her a very large saw to be able to cut the huge pumpkins he grew for her because she said, I can't cut them, they're too big and hard, so he bought her a saw.
Yes.
And he also gave her lovely lingerie.
Yes. But so Dad particularly had to learn this as he grew, and Dad carried some regrets later in life that he didn't know how to do this younger, but fortunately I helped them develop their parenting skills, and you got all to benefit from that.
You made the road easy for us because after Lex, the next 4 children were a breeze to raise. we actually wanted to do what was right.
Yeah.
But with Mum and Dad being very different personalities, but that sense of working together and there were times that inadvertently they were hurt by each other, but their love and their commitment that enabled them to, be there for each other and be there for us and to work through any difficulties they did have. And all relationships, there will be times when it's not just plain sailing, but it's, I think what they modelled for us is that love and that commitment that sees you through the difficult times, and that hanging in there and taking things to God in prayer rather than just reacting and allowing, what the hurt or the upset to be what controls the situation, because it wasn't.
I think a memory for me to do with that heart of prayer was it was in Bairnsdale, and we had guests coming over for dinner, and they always had an open home where people would come and be invited. But this particular stage, and this is the days before you operate with credit cards, and they didn't have any meat in the house, but they had plenty of veggies because Dad would have been growing lots of vegetables. Yes. And Mum had this sense, well, it's just not proper to, feed our guests vegetables and no meat. And so, she went off into the bedroom and just prayed and said, well, God, we got guests coming. I need to be able to provide the meat. And right now I don't have the money to be able to go get that. And a lady from the church who had never done this before, she was at the charcoal chicken shop across the road. And while she was in line there, she had this huge sense to buy a couple of chickens for Mum and Dad. And so she did that, and she came to the door and said, I just felt I had to buy you these. And 2 hot chickens were handed over. And it was that sense that we grew up that, the problem's not the issue so much, the people aren't the issue, but we can go to God and pray, and there's a way through. And I think that along with that commitment and that love is, well, no matter what you hit relationally, no matter what you hit with challenges and circumstances, you go to God with it, and He'll give you the wisdom, or He'll provide the way.
And I think seeing people as people loved by God, and so we felt the love in our family and the individual attention and care for each of us in our very different needs, quite different needs. But we also see all that in their relationship with other people as well, and the time and the care they took with people, and I think patience with people with personalities that could be quite challenging and difficult. I mean, we had their patience with us when we were perhaps a bit challenging and difficult at times.
It's not true. It's not true.
But it was there for others as well. And so I think that was a model for any and all relationships.
It was also modelled to us forgiveness. I saw Mum and Dad so quick to forgive other people that hurt them and other people around, and that was modelled. And I remember once someone needed some sleeping bags for something, and so Mum just went to our cupboard and loaned them my sleeping bag, Ken's sleeping bag, the sleeping bags we had there. And they never came back. I think they got burnt or something. But at the time, I remember I was quite furious that these people didn't even offer to replace them or anything like that. And to Mum, no, it's okay. We need to be generous and we need to forgive them because they didn't look after our sleeping bags very well. But yeah, as a kid, I had this reaction of that's not fair, that's not right, that's not just. Here's Mum bending over backwards to help people, and look what she got in return. But to Mum, what I saw was a heart of forgiveness and compassion, and you you loan something to someone with an open hand. If it doesn't come back, well, it's no big deal. God will give us another one.
And it was that one of the things I can remember Mum saying so often, people are more important than
I was
things.
just about to say that. So ingrained.
So
And it's, whether that situation or, we didn't have a lot materially, particularly probably when we were younger, more than when Linda was
Linda got
younger.
spoiled.
But we didn't need them because we had, the love in the home, and we had what we needed, and God was there, and we always had food, we had clothes, we had a home.
So, like, Mum and Dad are gone now, and yet without them, we still get on. How have we managed to do life together for so long? And so many families don't make it through. Like, even sometimes when a will happens, right? And I marvel at how relationally, as a family, we just really enjoy being with each other, and especially as we've all married. Like, I love hanging out with Alan.
He listens to your stories. He listens to you talk.
But I mean,
That's why he loves it.
your John is just such a gracious man, and like the family has just kept growing and growing, and the capacity to love has extended. There is nobody we don't like. I think that's quite remarkable. And like even last night, I'm taking my nephews and son-in-law out spotlighting and just hanging out together. It's wonderful. So how does that work? Instead of that just being what is reality, which it is, why does it work? Why does that take place? Any thoughts?
Well, it's easier because we're likeable people.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
Speak for yourself.
It's obviously much harder to love if you've got, a family
Obnoxious
member
people,
who has, really
hurtful.
messed up big time, or
Selfish.
has, or is just not a very nice person. So it's just a fact that it's been easy to love you guys and continue our relationship. And even though we may not have regular contact or even see each other for a year or so at a time, it's like it doesn't matter because of the strength of what has been there from history.
Yeah.
But I just want to encourage people that don't have as likeable family members or don't have the relationship there that there may have been there once, that it's never too late to turn things around and start to develop and grow. And we've seen that in, some of the family members of people within Red Gum already, where there's been some real breakthrough and a turnaround and start of a journey in a healthy direction. And so just because you may not have that at the moment, it doesn't mean that some work can't be done towards progressing forward.
Well, I remember this was a season I wasn't married yet, so I was actually living with Lex and Coral and helping on the farm. And I remember one time where we sat down and we talked through some of the issues and tensions of the family and the dynamics. And I think there was someone that was there helping coordinate that. I can't quite remember all the details, but I remember it was an environment where it was okay to be really honest and say, well, this is what I've struggled with, or this is what I've been hurt by. And it was an environment where openness was allowed, and an environment where being able to share but also forgive, and that took place. And so even though I probably wasn't the biggest issue in the conversation.
Yeah, what are you... Look, don't... Just little subtle things, Ken. Come out and say it. I was the problem, wasn't I? Yes.
We love you.
Yes.
I think there was probably some stronger tensions between you two.
Right.
But me being younger but being a part of that was just so valuable to say this is okay to have just an open conflict resolution moment where we talk honestly about where some of the tensions have been building and how do we move forward? How do we resolve that? How do we let that stuff go?
Well, I was always appreciative of Leonie. So Jeff's first wife, Leonie, when there was tension between Jeff and I, there would be a phone call from Leonie. And it was, come and sit down at the table, we're going to sort this out. And she did. And she saw the hurt that I'd caused Jeff, and she saw there a need for open, honest, and so she played a really big role in Jeff and I getting on okay today, you know. Yeah. She did, didn't she?
She did, and she actually struggled a bit in her own relationship with you for a period. And
none of this is true.
and yet there came a point where she brought that to God, and through that there was actually a real reconciliation with you.
Yes.
And the things that she had struggled with were, it was almost like she turned a corner, and those things were beyond her or behind her, and they weren't affecting her anymore.
Yes.
And she was able to love you, accept that you might have a few black spots, and yet, it wasn't holding back her relationship, and that was exciting for me to see her turn a corner in that journey too.
Yes. Yeah.
So it hasn't all been rosy, but it's been healthy, and there has been some things.
There is a very famous photo somewhere tucked away in the archives with Lindell, and you're probably, 10, 11 years of age or something, or
I think
younger.
I was in grade 6. I was
Grade
probably
6.
12, maybe.
Yeah. But I had this great capacity to make you cry. And I teased you and bullied you till you were really crying, and then I took a photo of you crying, just as a memento, right? So you've had to forgive me for stuff, haven't you?
And the ducks I had to pluck, and all the things.
I remember the electric fence one where you said, "Oh, Ken, just."
You're working on the farm for us.
Oh yes, I was very upset that day that you set me up to get zapped.
But you checked to make sure the electric fence wasn't on, and it wasn't. But I deliberately switched it on to see how you reacted when you were working on a fence that was live, and when I actually drove up to see how you were so offended with me. I thought it was funny. But you thought that I betrayed the trust that you'd put in me.
That was the case. And I think, yes, there's been issues and bumps along the way that we've had to acknowledge where there's offence or pain or hurt, work that through and forgive, as was modelled for us by our parents. But I think they also modelled grace and acceptance. And I think that's what each of us have brought, that we've been able to say, okay, we're all quite different in many ways, some similarities, but some differences. And how do we just graciously accept someone that's quite different, but learn to value some of those differences and actually celebrate those aspects? And I think that goes beyond just, okay, we've dealt with some pain and some hurt or conflict, but actually we can rejoice at each other's differences and uniqueness.
And value, appreciate, the gifts and the strengths that each other has.
So just any thoughts as we're starting to wrap up a little bit on what we've taken through, from what we've grown up with to our own relationships with each other, and then into our own families, because now we have our own families. You've got thousands of grandkids, Jeff. But what have we taken into the next generation? Because relationship-wise, everyone's relationships are intact, despite all the stuff of life. So what have you taken through to your families that you think could be helpful?
Well, I think going back to Mum and Dad, I remember always feeling, as you mentioned before, that I just felt it was impossible that Mum and Dad would ever split up. I know now through maturity that it's not impossible at all, and we all need to really work on our marriages, but that was the feeling I had growing up, and that was a really healthy feeling to have. And if I can, to my own adult children, if they can see that Kath and I, as different as we are from each other, that if they can see that, no, we're going to be staying till death us do part, then hopefully that's something that they can then help take on board for their own children too. And whatever it takes for people to know, not just a pretend thing, but actually know that this is a relationship that through thick or thin, it's still going to be there. There will still be Jeff and Kath in 10 years' time and 20 years' time. At least I hope so.
Any other thoughts?
Just, I would agree with that, but Mum and Dad would never have supported an abusive relationship hanging in together, and that's a different matter. It's about working on healthy relationships and that commitment that can see you through the tensions and the differences. And I think some of it's just helping. I think they helped us to see what a healthy relationship looks like. And I think, yes, for our children to sort of know healthy relationships and not abusive relationships.
I think a principle that my wife Brie and myself have brought into our relationship, we didn't hear it originally from Mum and Dad, but it was totally true of Mum and Dad. And it was give and give and give, and if you ever get anything back, it's a bonus. And so we developed early in our relationship this heart, well, we allow God to fill our emotional tank. And yes, we can communicate our needs to one another, but we come with an attitude of, I'm giving 100%, regardless of whether I ever get back 100%. And God is the one that can give us when we're not feeling it from the other person. And that was modelled by Mum and Dad. They were their sense of ability to give, not just to us, to many, many people. And they lived their life being poured out. And out of that always came back more. And we've seen that as we've picked up and run with that same kind of value.
Yes. So we had a big family gathering yesterday, and extra kids, your kids, their new wives or new children and that, and I'm seeing this next generation, right? And so how do you carry things into the next generation? How do you help the next generation? I mean, there are people that are listening and watching this now. You have already behind you broken relationships. There's the debris of all the stuff that's happened prior to right now. So how do you move forward now? How do you do something that will help even the relationships? Like I've got a friend in Tassie, and he hasn't seen some of his kids for a long time. And as he's just been praying, God supernaturally, even just around Christmas, one of his sons came home, hadn't seen him for 4 years, turned up with a hamper, and he was praying for these things he needed, and his own son and girlfriend brought them into his life. Now, a year ago, my friend in Tassie, he was in a very dark place, and God's been healing him and restoring him, and now it's coming out in the family. So there's this God factor. You cannot dismiss it. You cannot lay it down, because that is the ingredient in all this that changes what's impossible. Dad would often say that God can do. Do you remember what he'd quote, Ken?
No, you say.
I can't remember it, but it's something that God can do the impossible. Something like there's a verse in the Bible, I'm sure, it says that.
I think for me, and what I would want to pass on to my children and the following generations from what we've learnt from Mum and Dad, is that God was their source of life and living, and they passed on to us what we needed more than anything else in life was the love and the truth of God and unconditional love. And they really helped us to know that the love and that God is love, that God is good, and that God is powerful, and there is no situation, there is no circumstance, there is no mistake or failure that is beyond God's ability to change and to redeem. And so there was always this deep trust in God's goodness and love and power. And I remember Dad saying, to us, before he died, put God first, because when things go wrong, and they will, God will see you through, and that God can bring blessing, God can bring change. And to me, that was so important, and that our children know that God is good and go to him first in everything, because stuff can go wrong.
Yes.
But God will see you through.
Yeah.
And can,
Any last thoughts, anyone?
I think picking up on Lyndell's comment, the sense of God's ability to redeem, and I think that's where more issues and challenges was this sense that give it to God, trust God in it, and if you've heard God, follow through. No matter what it looks like, God's faithful.
Yes.
God can redeem it. And so whether it's a sleeping bag gone or something like, it's like those things become less of a disruption in your world, because it's, well, God's bigger than that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Any last thoughts?
Lindell and Ken have said it well.
Yeah. Well, I just want to really thank you all for being part of this morning. It's been fun, and just really hope that this has been helpful for you guys. And we're flicking from one camera to another. Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate that. But it's just really, we want to take you on a journey. It doesn't matter where you are right now. Even if all your relationships are falling apart around you, God has answers. There are ways forward. There's emotional health that can come for you, because, as Jeff said earlier, if we're likable, if we're emotionally whole, it makes it easier to do relationships. But when you're hurting, when you're just ripped apart inside, it's hard to do life within yourself, let alone with other people. So there are answers, there is hope, and as we continue this series, there'll be times you won't remember this whole conversation, but you're right, remember something that you can take into your world that'll make a difference. So thank you for being with us this morning, and we do care. Thank you. Yep.